You have in your sheets here's the first issue that you'll encounter frequently with observant Jewish patients. There is something called the goses, or goses means a person who's dying. The traditional Jewish belief is that a person who is dying is like a flickering flame. That's the way the rabbis called them. A flickering flame, and you don't want to put out the candle. I remember when I first started working here, one of my first weeks here, we had a patient in Saperstein who was dying, and obviously Saperstein's ICU. They wanted to move the patient to 4 South, but the family was trying to explain that they were afraid the patient would die if they moved into Saperstein. But it also made sense because ICU, you need patients who need ICU level care. So anyways, though they did move the patient, and literally while they're crossing the bridge, on the little bumps over the bridge, the patient died, and the family felt like it was the hospital's fault because they shouldn't have moved the patient. Whatever was right or was wrong, it was like a reminder to me of that statement in the Talmud that a dying patient is like a flickering flame, and we don't want to put out the candle. So the question is always, when is the patient in that state that they're dying? So, a lot of you on your floors, you deal with dying patient, like dying patient protocol, a patient who's really in the dying process, the agonal breathing, and you can tell that their blood pressure is dropping and they're in the dying process. So once we've determined that they are in the dying process, we call them a goses. And this is when treatment changes in Jewish tradition, Jewish law, which is that for a goses, so now I'm here in number 1 there, for a goses, we try not to touch them because we're afraid that touching them hastens death. But this is kind of complicated because what does that mean for a nurse or a doctor? So we say that only things that are medically necessary should they be touched for. So lots of lab draws and there's lots of things that are routine, laboratory tests and checks that we actually ask not to happen for patients in the dying process. It makes sense. Usually just someone has to order the change, but it makes sense that we don't need to do tests and draw blood for someone who's in the dying process. And this is something that people will often ask for. But there is a little bit of nuance, which is that, first of all, if it's for a person's comfort, if there's interventions that a nurse or a doctor needs to do to keep the patient comfortable, then that's obviously for sure allowed. Even though we're scared that we could hasten death, the first goal is keeping a person comfortable. So we are allowed to do things to a patient if the goal is their comfort. Also, interestingly, if a patient will recognize, because many Orthodox, observant Jewish patients know this law, that we don't touch a patient who's dying, what if they would recognize that we stop touching them and they're like, oh no, does this mean that I'm dying? Usually people know, but maybe they don't. What if they would become very scared because we're not touching them anymore? So Jewish law is actually that in that case we would continue to touch them if we felt that they would be scared by us not intervening. Then we would actually be allowed. Interesting. And the other thing is that people ask me this all the time. Probably the saddest time this was asked was with the baby that was dying. People are afraid that you can't touch a person who's dying, so what about hugging them or holding them or kissing them or holding their hands? So in that case, it's for sure allowed because it's for their comfort. You can hold someone and comfort them to comfort them. However, I said it's for sure allowed. There are some people who would feel, some rabbis, who feel in certain cases, like a case we had here once with a baby who was dying, and their rabbi felt that they should not hold the baby because it was hastening the death. So, okay, that's something that I don't tell people. I tell them that they should, but I respected their opinion, and I was trying to explain to the staff the reason for that, at least. They should understand the nuance that the parents didn't want to feel that they were hastening the death. So instead of holding the baby, they still made sure to comfort the baby and touch the baby in other gentle ways. But this is the whole idea of the flickering flame. So that's just point number 1 to be aware of, that this concern about hastening death through touch. Any comments or questions? Okay, this isn't really the main part yet anyways, but this is kind of background. Okay, so number 2 is that there is a belief that a person who's dying, it's like a very, there's a certain reverence they're supposed to have for that. We get used to it in hospitals, we get used to death. I remember I take students down to the autopsy room sometimes to watch autopsies. I remember once we saw there was someone eating during an autopsy, and that was really shocking to me. But I get it, because if you do it every day, multiple times a day, you get used to it. But there's technically, again, according to Jewish law, we don't eat in a room when someone's dying. We're supposed to treat it like it's a very holy space. And that's just something to be aware of, that people are not supposed to like even talk about things other than the person. It's like a very auspicious moment. There's also a concept of trying not to let someone die alone. I don't know if you remember this program that we had here called No One Dies Alone. It was very hard to keep it going because sometimes it would happen in the middle of the night, or it would happen, people wouldn't actually want it, or it would end up being like 10-hour shifts and we couldn't find people to always be there when someone's dying. Actually, the first patient we had, it was on 4 Southwest. We had a patient who was dying, and we had this new thing, No One Dies Alone. Call the chaplaincy department and we'll send someone. So the only one available at that time was our priest. They said, this patient's dying, it should be just an hour or two at the most. Someone could come and sit by the patient. So the priest went up, sat by the patient, an hour or two passed, and the patient woke up. And he was okay. And they were like, oh my gosh, the priest miraculously cured the patient. So he put our program out of business because he's like a miraculous, I'm joking, but it really did happen. But it was really wild. It was the first time we ever did it, and the guy came back to life. But anyways, that happens now and then. But there's this idea that dying alone, we believe that when a person dies, good to see you. Okay, if you have any questions for an expert, I'm just going to defer to you. We believe that when a person dies, it's scary for their soul. Because, we believe that the person's, it says in the Talmud that, a person's soul is happy with God, and then it has to go into a body, and it's uncomfortable being in a human body because it was happy being spiritual. But then it gets used to being a body and not being spiritual. And then when we die and the soul goes back to God, it's scary again because it forgot what it's like to be pure and with God. So because of that fear, there's this belief that it's to mitigate the fear, we should, if we have people who are standing there with the patient, it's less scary. So you might have this. We find, I bet some of you have seen this, we have found very frequently that patients who are dying and people maintain a vigil by the room, sometimes it's right when someone finally leaves, that's when they die. Have you seen that? We see it a lot. And you never know. Maybe it's the person doesn't want to cause their friend or loved one to be afraid. But I don't know if anyone can actually control when they die, but maybe a little bit. But anyways, there is this belief. So you might sometimes see, and we see this a lot with patients, where a family kind of keeps a vigil, that they want to have someone there at all times, not even going home to shower or anything. But that is a traditional belief. Any questions, comments to this point? Okay, so next. This I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I'm going to go to the next piece is what we're going to spend the most time on, but just to briefly mention, because some people might be aware of this, there is a Jewish custom that when someone dies, we tear our clothing. This happens at funerals. This is what we do out of grief in the moment. It's biblical, tearing clothing out of grief when someone dies. So technically, the traditional Jewish practice is that anytime you're with someone who dies, you tear your clothing. So first of all, an observant Jewish nurse or doctor technically would be required to tear their clothing. Also a chaplain. I'm with people who die basically every day. That's why I am a frequent flyer at them. No, I'm joking. That is the custom, but we don't really observe that anymore because a few reasons. We usually wait to the funeral till we're guided by the rabbi how and when to do it. The custom is to do it at the most painful time. Sometimes we argue that when the body goes down into the earth, that's the most painful time. Also, there's a fear that what I just said, that there's a benefit of having someone present with the deceased as they die. So we're afraid what will happen. It's look at my new suit. I don't want to go up to that room if I'm going to have to tear my new suit. So people are not, it's just joking, it's the old suit, but people are not going to go to be with the patient if they're going to have to tear their clothes. So the custom developed not to tear clothing in the room anymore. Actually, one time someone called me, and it was the son of a patient. He said, I want to know how to tear my shirt when my mom dies. He said this right in front of her. So I was like, maybe we should step outside of the hallway. So we did, and she's looking at us so he asked me, how do I tear my shirt? What do I do? So I said, you know what, don't worry about it, because you'll do it at the funeral. Your rabbi will show you how to do it. Don't worry about that. Just spend your time with your mother, and when the time comes, you'll tear your shirt at the funeral. So he says, okay, fine. So next day I come to visit again. He's sitting with his mother again, and I see his shirt is totally torn, and his mother's awake, alert. So I was like, what is going on here? So I said, hey, maybe we could go step out in the hallway again? So we stepped outside, and I was like, so I see you figured out how to tear your shirt, huh? He was like, oh yeah, I called my rabbi, and he explained how to do it. So I was like, so you did it already? He was like, yeah, I was afraid I wouldn't know how to do it because he explained it's a little hard. You have to go in, and I didn't understand. So I just did it on the phone as he described it. So I was like, oh, who's your rabbi? So I called the rabbi, and it's not someone you would know because he's not here in town anymore. But I said, Rabbi, what happened? So he goes, he did it in the room in the hospital? I was like, yeah. He's like, I don't know. I'm a Kohen. It's a type of Jew that doesn't like to be around dead bodies. He's like, I don't go to the hospital. I don't know. I was just telling you, but I wasn't there. So I was like, we should be more careful in the future. Because the Jewish law says it's forbidden to tear when someone's still alive, because we're not supposed to scare a person. Just like we talked about before, touching someone who's dying, we also try not to scare someone who's dying. And this is part of that category. So anyways, there are some people, I have seen this, who, because, like I said, we don't tear our clothing anymore, like, I don't know, do you even own the nurse's stuff you wear? Do you even own that? Is it yours? Yeah. It is the scrubs? Okay. Because some of the rabbis say you don't have to because it's like someone else's property, so it wouldn't be right. They came up with all these reasons why you shouldn't have to do it. But still, a lot of the rabbis thought, like, what? What'd you say?
I said they would have to get me new ones then.
Right. Okay, maybe if you want to have a new pair every week. So there are some people that do tear still today, but what they do is they pull out their shirt and just tear at the bottom so they don't ruin their clothing. Some people do that. I've seen that, but it's not really required to do that. Anyways, that's a side point. Now we come to really the main focus of our discussion, which is now page 2. It's really the next 2 pages, but okay. So what happens? So that's all before someone dies. That's all the dying process and the death itself. Any other questions about the questions that you had asked at the beginning about being involved with hastening death and things like that? Maybe we'll talk about at the end. But in terms of just caring for a patient who's in the dying process, these are the main points. Being with them and not doing things that hasten death, including touching them unnecessarily or scaring them. Yes?
So don't we have, according, I guess, to Jewish law, we have to do all we can to save the life, like someone's life, as far as medical care goes? So when do we know where to draw the line and just stop?
Yeah. Okay, so this is really the question that's being asked. So really, I don't agree with what you said completely. Here's how we say it. We do everything we can to prolong life. That is a Jewish value. We do everything we can to prolong life. The Talmud says that if a building collapses on Shabbat and someone's trapped under there, if you're not sure, let's say it would be transgressing Shabbat to dig them out, and you're not sure if someone's there, would you still dig them out? What if you're sure someone's there, but you think they're probably dead already? Then could you still transgress Shabbat? Yeah. What if they're most likely dead? Still, we do everything we can to prolong life in Jewish law. However, we do not prolong the dying process. We don't prolong suffering. There's a story in the Talmud. It's a really important story. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was the great rabbi, author of the Mishnah, one of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud. And when he was dying, there was a woman who lived in his house. She was called the Amsa Debe Rebbe. She was like his assistant. She was a very wise woman too. She's often quoted in the Talmud, like she translated words and told us certain laws. So when he was dying, all of his students gathered around his house, and they were praying for him to recover. And she was also in the house with him, praying for him to recover. But he kept on having to get up and take off his tefillin and go to the bathroom and get up, and he was like suffering and in horrible pain. And she realized all of a sudden, like, wait a second, all the students are praying for him to live, but I see his life as a horrible life. He's suffering, he's in bad shape. I don't think his life is a good life. So she started praying for him to die. But then she realized the students' prayers are stronger than my prayers. So she went on the roof, she took a huge jug, they couldn't see her, she smashed it to the ground, it exploded on the ground, they all became afraid and they stopped praying. And in that second they stopped praying, he died. And we see from that there is, even though we want to prolong life, we don't prolong the dying process. When someone's dying in the dying process, we allow natural death. This is what, we call DNAR at this hospital, DNR, do not resuscitate. A better phrase for it is AND, allow natural death. We never hasten death. We never make people die faster. We want to prolong life. We err on the side of prolonging life. That's our value. But when someone is dying and it's irreversible and the only thing we can do is make sure they don't suffer more, we can't cause, but we can allow natural death. So, and it happens every day, right? Everyone dies, unfortunately. But any other questions? Does that make sense? this is why, I mean, this kind of answers the questions that you're asking at the beginning, like, can you provide morphine and things like that? I mean, if it's to help relieve suffering, but not to hasten death, then it's allowed. In fact, it's a mitzvah. As long as the person really is dying, they have to be in the dying process. They have to have a terminal, there's something that's actually causing them to die. It's not just that, they're really upset about, the Lakers or something, which is definitely upsetting lately, but yes.
With morphine, I'm just curious, so it comforts the patient pain-wise, it's a palliative, but I don't know enough about it. Does it also expedite death or facilitate, does it do both?
It doesn't necessarily expedite death, especially if it's given carefully. Now we have sophisticated palliative care such that we can try our best to ensure that it's being given in dosages that relieve suffering but don't hasten death. It could slow down respiration. It's not clear. There's lots of studies that show different things. But as long as it's being given with the intention to relieve suffering, it's allowed. Yes?
I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
I've seen situations that patient is actually looks very comfortable. But
Yeah.
when the morphine breathes and when you stop it, in a matter of 1 or 3 or 4 hours, you don't see any changes in the patient, whereas just the breathing is still going on, but just keep them on the morphine with the intention of the patient fasting.
So that's not right. It should be given only with the intention of relieving suffering, only the amount needed to relieve suffering.
I can understand that the patient is suffering, you see the grimaces, you feel the anxiety and all that, that's
Right.
fine, but when the patient is only on the drip,
Right.
well, the patient is laying down without any appearance of any suffering.
Right. Yeah, could be different. Yasmin.
I know each case is very individualized, so my case might be a little bit different, but one time I was in a situation where I had a patient, Jewish guy, and I know the family he was from, but they weren't there, and he became DNR, and then they came to put in the patient on a morphine drip, and this was my first time being exposed to it, and I kind of was put on the spot as the primary nurse, not really knowing the halacha, so they asked me, the morphine, is it allowed? Because the family sat there, not sure what to do. They didn't have me to call at that time. And for me, I'm thinking morphine does cause, one of the side things you learned, it does cause respiratory suppression. But in a case where someone is already made, it was a new thing. They just change a patient from full code to DNR. In that case, we give the morphine, or given that it has side effects, if it's a PCA pump, I imagine that's different. It's designed for comfort measures, but in a situation like that where someone's already at that, on their way of death, and the morphine does provide comfort, however, it does also cause respiratory suppression.
Right.
You generalize it under, okay, the patient is suffering, let me give this for the comfort, or, are we gonna individualize this particular case and see, given all the factors of their age and how sick they are, that it actually essentially will make death go.
Right. So you're right, it's case by case. Very often it's totally allowed and actually encouraged because it's relieving suffering, even if it could, as a side effect, hasten death. But it's important to remember that you never have to do something that you're not comfortable with, and you shouldn't. So if you're not comfortable with it, you should ask not to. Someone asked at the beginning, we're not going to go into this now, but about physician aid in dying. It's happened here, but no one who isn't uncomfortable with it should have to be involved with that, and they're not required to. And if anyone is ever given a problem with any of this, please come contact the spiritual care department. We'll make sure to advocate for you.
No, it was
But
in a different hospital.
I know it was in Florida, right? Didn't you tell that story
No, it was
once?
in California.
Oh, okay. You told another story once about Florida with Russia Weiss.
That was here.
Oh.
That was in here.
Oh, okay.
Not this hospital.
My memories don't serving me. Okay, so let's go. Yes.
But being placed, if the patient is on full resuscitation category 1, and then they're moved over, let's say they're in ICU, they're moved over to category 3, don't do anything. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're go safe at that point. They're
Right.
going to start.
Yes,
So
definitely not.
It's a decision that is being
Right.
made of what do you want to do next in terms of planning.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean all of a sudden, okay, they're now category 3, let's put on the morphine pump.
Yeah, it's important to recognize that even if someone has a DNR, it doesn't mean do not treat. They should still be treated with all.
Right, you have to treat them with everything that you're supposed to, but you're not pumping on the person's chest. You're not going to starting a chemical code.
Right. Right. Very good. Yes. Good point. Okay. So now on page 2 is what happens once the patient dies. once death is declared. So there's a few things. One is that in Jewish culture and Jewish law, we like to bury as quickly as possible. I remember one time walking to my car at the end of the day, and it was like 6 o'clock. I was getting in my car. I get a call from the ICU, from the social worker there, and she was like, "Rabbi, I need your help. How can we make sure that the family here, patient so-and-so, wants to make sure the funeral is going to be tomorrow? I know it's already 6 o'clock, but can we make sure that the funeral is tomorrow?" So I was like, "Oh gosh, okay, we'll try. I'm coming back right now. Where's the body? Is the body already picked up by the mortuary, or is the body here still in the ICU?" She's like, wait, no, body? No, the patient's still alive. They just want to make sure that when the patient dies, the funeral will be tomorrow. I was like, "No, we don't need to plan yet for tomorrow. Let's wait for them to die, and then." But there is the custom that you try to bury as quickly as possible. Sometimes it happens the same day here, but that's rare. It's usually a day or two, sometimes more. But we often need help, and there's oftentimes a lot of pressure to make sure that we get the death certificate signed. Oftentimes the staff can really help us to make sure we get a signature from the death certificate. That one of the challenges sometimes is that a family member needs to sign as well. On Shabbat, can't always sign, so verbal authorization is totally fine. I mean, oftentimes we don't even sign, even during the weekdays. We give verbal authorization. But assistance with helping things happen quickly is very appreciated and makes a big difference. And can allow the family to, contact their mortuary and their rabbi. Oftentimes, observant Jewish patients are not going to want the body to go down to the morgue for reasons we're going to talk about soon, which include the desire to have someone near the body saying prayers at all times. So instead of the body going to the morgue, usually the mortuary, the chevra kaddisha, will come up to the room. We usually get 4 hours. As you know, there's like the policy in the hospital, you get 4 hours. There have been times when we've been able to extend that a little bit. And there are times we have to advocate, to encourage patients to go downstairs to the morgue. And we do set up a chair outside the morgue sometimes when people need to sit out there, family members. So sometimes we utilize that. But we're trying to make things happen as quickly as possible. And then there's a number of customs when it comes to positioning the body. These are things that we would not ask a nurse to just do these things without being aware of having been asked to do them, but you should be aware that you might get asked to do these things, or that family members might want to do this. And this is oftentimes, as chaplains, one of the things that when families ask us to help them prepare the body, so there's roles that the chaplain might play more, and there's roles that the nurses will play much more. This is one role that the chaplain might play more, which is that we position, first of all, there's like a little bit of a time that we wait after a person dies. Because of the whole discussion that we had, there's some sheets there I could take. The whole discussion that we had regarding waiting, not touching a person when they're dying. So there is a traditional Jewish belief that we're not totally sure that someone's dead because we're waiting for all circulation to stop and like the soul to leave the body. And we're not always sure when the soul leaves the body. Sometimes we can be sure that person doesn't have a soul at all, but no, I'm joking. But how can we be sure when the person's soul has left the body? So there's this customary waiting period where we actually do nothing for a few minutes. Sometimes I use that personally just as a side point. Sometimes we get calls, as chaplains to come when a patient's dying to say prayers before they die, and then we get there like 2 minutes too late. So we often say, well, you know what? There's like that 20-minute period where we're not really sure if they're dead yet. So usually we say after someone's declared dead, we don't do anything to their body for a little while. First we leave them, and then we have a list here of all the things that we do. There's a traditional custom, you might get asked this frequently, I get asked all the time, to open the window. There's a belief that the soul needs to go out through the window. The windows here don't open, if you've noticed. So it's okay, we figure the soul can get out, you can find another way out. But that's the tradition, to open the window. There's a lot of customs that are Jewish customs that we don't do in hospitals, but people ask about them all the time. We often, traditionally, would light a candle in a room when someone dies. Usually, we don't do that in a hospital. We can't light candles in a hospital, right? There's a custom of pouring out water. We're not really sure what the reason was. Maybe it was to let people know that the death had occurred, or there's like some kind of concern about impurity. Any water that was out at the time of death, they pour it out onto the floor. Not on the body, on the floor. But we don't really do that in the hospital. We don't start pouring out water. And then there's a custom to put the body on the floor. Mystical practice that the body's put on the floor. So that also, I mean, we don't usually put the bodies on the floor in the rooms. Sometimes I have seen the mortuary very briefly take the body off the bed onto the floor and then onto the stretcher, very briefly, just to fulfill that custom. But it's something that you don't usually see here. What you do see here is, one thing is we close the eyes. There's a belief that this is like mystical stuff. I don't really understand totally, but that, we believe that the other world is much more beautiful than this world, right? But as long as a person's eyes are open, they can't see that world. That's the mystical belief. And even though their soul has gone, they can't totally see it yet because their body is still looking at this world. And the belief is if you close the eyes, it allows the soul to enjoy the world to come. So there's this custom, especially it's customary for the children or the firstborn son to be the one to close the eyes if possible. I find a lot of times in the rooms at these moments that people are afraid, so I often end up doing it. But if they can do it, it's a nice thing. Often it doesn't work, but we don't do anything about it. Also to close the mouth, because it's considered to be like an indignity for the person's mouth to be open. So this is a little more complicated. We have to, to close the mouth sometimes takes work. When I first started here, I used to do it with pillowcases and tie it around the head and then tie it on top. But I always felt like it looked gruesome, like you're choking the person. I mean, I know they're dead, but it just always felt funny about it. Sometimes we stick up a pillow, but the way lately we've been doing it that I think is the best is with a gauze. And we just put the gauze around the head a few times and close the mouth. And it's just considered to be the person's, dignified. And then there's a tradition to be laying totally flat. This is how in the Bible, it describes Aaron when he dies, that he was flat. He was straight out. So we put the legs out, the arms out. But the tradition is, there's different customs, but the way that I always learned to do it is that we put the hands straight but opened up. Because this is it says that you come into the world, with a baby come into the world with their hands clenched, symbolically, and we leave the world with our hands open. Meaning you come into the world, take as much as you can from this world, do as much good as you can, but then you leave the world with only with your good deeds. There's nothing you can take with you. People are buried in shrouds with no pockets. So we put their hands straight. It doesn't always work. That doesn't stay. You don't have to go crazy trying to force the body to stay, but we just basically put limbs, hands straight. Sometimes I've seen people even tie the toes together to keep the legs from falling off. Usually here, the mortuary puts a body bag over the body anyway, so the legs don't fall off, but it's a tradition in trying to make sure that they keep the person's dignity, that they're kind of all kept on the stretcher. Someone once told me a different reason for this custom that I thought was interesting. Rabbi Zone told me that there's a belief that perhaps there used to be deathbed conversions, that after Jews would die in Europe, they would convert them before they buried them to Christianity. And so the Jews, to try to prevent them from being converted, part of it was crossing the heart. So they did the opposite of having their hands straight. Interesting, historical context. Any questions about any of that?
So you see something in Christian hospitals specifically cross-arm patients?
Yes, right. Yeah, so I just spent time at a Catholic hospital, and I asked the chaplain there what they do, and he says, yes, they cross the heart every time a patient dies.
So if I'm writing a death note on a patient, do I wait an extra 20 minutes before I leave the room?
No.
So am I healed to do any of these?
No. It's just that we don't touch the body for those 20 minutes. It's just that part of that belief, what I said at the beginning, that we don't touch a person who's dying. So we believe that for those 20 minutes, they're kind of still dying. But there are some who say that doesn't even exist anymore, because now today we have sophisticated enough technology that we can determine death. And in the olden days, it wasn't as sure. Like the Saved by the Bell. You all know Saved by the Bell, where that comes from? No. It's not just Zach and,
Oh, there's the ringer, dead ringer.
Yeah. So it used to be that people sometimes got buried alive because they weren't sure. They thought they were dead, but they didn't have good enough testing, and there was other reasons that they weren't responsive, and they actually weren't dead. They were buried alive. And they started finding people. It's horrible to think about, but when they would sometimes move graves, they would find the inside of a grave with fingernails scratched that the person tried to get out. So they started putting in holes into the graves with a little string and a bell for the first few days, such that if a person woke up in their grave, in their casket, they could ring the bell, and they'd be saved by the bell.
The dead ringer. That's where that comes from.
Dead ringer.
Yeah.
Yes, very good. Yeah, it's spooky. But so some say those 20 minutes, you don't have to really even worry about it. But that's just a custom. We say leave the body alone for 20 minutes. We say you could put the body on its side, but we believe that's always disrespectful to put a body on its face. So we try to put the body either on its side or on its back. When We try to cover the genitals of the body when there are times when the body's left exposed. We try to at least cover for like basic modesty, and also you can, if the body's gonna be waiting for a few hours in the room, we try to turn the air conditioning down and use a light sheet. It's customary to cover the head. All the things I'm telling you is, of course, assuming the family wants this, right? Family sometimes don't want this, and we don't push on them. I'm just telling you what the tradition is. Traditionally, there's a belief that a person's face, dead, is like mystically not good for them to be exposed. It's better for them for it to be covered. So ideally, we cover the face, cover the whole body with a light sheet, because we don't want to cause already any kind of, what? What word did you use?
To expedite the decomposition.
Yeah, exactly. To expedite decomposition and smells and things like that, because that's also not in their dignity. So we use light sheets, cool room, and then when they're let out of the room, we lead them out feet first. The tradition is always go feet first. Yeah. Any questions about all this? Positioning? Yes.
Well, not on positioning, but when do
Anything.
we actually pronounce the patient deceased? After the 20 minutes, or
Before.
pronounce them and then give them the 20 minutes?
Yeah, exactly. Once it's pronounced, then we wait some time. Yeah. But it doesn't mean you can't start like calling the decedent affairs or the crisis nurse or whoever and start planning, making things move. We do like things to happen quickly. It might be worth just mentioning now, we do have in this hospital some, many Jewish patients who, especially, not to stereotype, it's just like, what I find it the most with is with Persian patients, that people are very expressive with their mourning, right? See this? And it's especially common in Iranian culture, but that's because that's traditional culture. And in the Talmud, in traditional Judaism, this was an important practice, to cry and mourn expressively. They used to even hire people for funerals to scream and cry, because that was considered to be a person's honor. If you really love someone, you would cry when they die. So that was a way of showing you love them. So we often find that we have family members who go through this process of screaming and crying. We get calls often in the chaplaincy to calm them down. We even hear sometimes about them being sent to the emergency room or calling security because this family is screaming, they're crazy. So oftentimes our role is to try to explain to the staff, this is normal, this is culturally appropriate, and we should allow them to scream and cry and mourn. We should probably just have them do it inside the room, not publicly. We should also recognize that it might be cyclical, like when more family shows up, even though they might have calmed down, it's going to start all over again. Or when a family member calls, it's going to start all over again. This is part of the reason why we want to let it happen and allow them to mourn, allow them to cry, show them that respect. So sometimes that 20 minutes gives them that time. But then that's why we also want to move things along, because it's helping them too. There is a time for crying and a time for then planning the funeral. That's why as chaplains, oftentimes we'll say, okay, let them cry. And then at a certain point we'll say, let's say some prayers. And we'll say the prayers very softly and slowly, try to change the mood in the room. And then working with the staff, if we can get the mortuary to come quickly, then the family member, they're crying, they're praying, now they're moving towards the funeral, not to plan the funeral, helps them move to the next stage. So we do like to move things quickly, but yes, also give them a little bit of space.
You ever had a situation where you had such a reaction with the voices in the next room?
Yeah, definitely.
That can create, I can imagine why you'd have to quiet them down for
Yeah.
the purpose of preserving the...
Yeah, it scares the people in the other rooms. It's an important issue.
Is there a custom about how long one should or should not stay in the room with the dead body?
Okay, so I think this might even be the next thing. Yeah, it's perfect. So number 3. So the next issue is what's called in Hebrew shmira or shomer. There is a tradition, I mentioned before, to not leave a body alone after a person's died. We have people, if you ever have a family who's looking for someone, have on my phone a few contacts, be in touch with us and we'll be happy to there are people who will come and sit with the body. One of the great things about the mortuaries is that they have someone there 24 hours. Someone there saying prayers, so if they get sent to the mortuary, to the chevra kaddisha, then that's covered. But the truth is, in the hospital, it's really not as required. The tradition was that there was 2 reasons mentioned in the Talmud for this. One was to prevent rats from coming and getting the body. So hopefully we're not worried about that at Cedars-Sinai. That shouldn't happen and you don't need to be there to guard the patient in the room that a rat's going to come and start eating them. And also, it's like dignity that a person is not left alone. So some of the great rabbis say, first of all, if they're in the hospital, you don't really have to be there. Some say you could be there, but you don't have to be in the same room. So when we have people that go to the morgue, especially on Shabbat, it's a big problem because our morgue isn't the best morgue in the world for families. There is a little viewing room. I don't know how many of you have been to the morgue on the lower level, North Tower. There's a little viewing room there, but outside the morgue, it's just a hallway. And we once had, I remember one case, we had a family there, patient died, of course, we were planning for weeks. Patient died right after Shabbat began. Once Shabbat begins, no phone, no electricity, no traveling. So they went down to the morgue, sat, we gave him a chair. We had it set up before Shabbat just in case. Security was warned, but Tony Morris was already home for the weekend, no one was there. The person went and sat in a chair in the hallway from 6 p.m. Friday night till 8 p.m. Saturday night, without moving, without eating, without going to the bathroom. Yeah, and they felt this was the right thing to do for their family member. And so they did that. It's hard. We've had people more recently have told me they stayed in the hospital the whole Shabbat because their loved one was here, but they would go get some food, lay down on the couch in the plaza, but they stayed in the building. Different people have different customs. It's not required for a person to be here, and like I said, you can hire someone, but some mortuaries will actually pick up on Shabbat. Most do not. What do you guys do? You do pick up. They send a driver who's not Jewish, and they'll pick up. Yeah. So that helps. If the mortuary is going to pick up, then you have someone waiting there at the mortuary who's going to say the prayers. So that's helpful. But that's the custom. There's a custom to have someone there, but it's not required. So for family members who want to leave and go home and be with the other family members or plan the funeral or need to go get, a lot of times people get buried in Israel or New York and they have to start planning. They don't have to stay in the hospital the whole time. And we've had a few times with our chaplains where people have asked us, I'm going to leave. Could you just check in and kind of have someone who checks in on the patient until they're picked up on the mortuary or something like that, and we're happy to provide that service. So the next issue, and then we'll conclude and have any other questions, is what to do with the body. This is especially nursing relevant. This is now, we're on page 3, number 2 there, is that, we believe that a few issues. One is that a body is considered sacred, and that there are certain things that need to be buried. So we believe in, the person needs to be buried. So someone asked about a limb, I think before. We bury limbs as long as there's bone and some muscle or sinew, we bury it. Actually, remember not too long ago, someone got their toe amputated, and they wanted it to be buried. So what we did is we held it until the kaddisha would next come. The guy came and dropped it off in my office, and it was sitting in my office for a week until it got picked up. Just sitting there, and it looked like a sandwich kind of. It was packaged. Every time someone would be in my office, they'd be like, "Oh, you have lunch ready?" I'm like, "No, you don't want to know what's in that package." But we bury limbs and body parts, and the goal is not when a person we expect hopefully will live for many more years. But especially when a person's dying, we want them to be buried with everything, especially when they die. So if someone bleeds when they're dying, that blood often gets lost. But if there's blood that's lost as a result of their death, like a hemorrhage or something, that blood's called dam hanefesh, and it needs to be buried with them. So sometimes that means we even bury the sheets. If the sheets get all bloody, this is why in Israel you sometimes see, God forbid, when there's a terrorist attack, you see people going in the streets and really scraping up blood and body parts because that all needs to get buried. So the biggest question is about lines. This is the question we deal with the most often. So I have a list here of what we do. First of all, washing, there's a traditional custom of washing the body, but we don't wash the body in the hospital. Because we're concerned, we want to make sure everything gets buried, we leave the body. The mortuary has a special way that they wash the body, and they're very good at it, and we leave it for them to do the washing. So any tubes, like IV lines, gastric tubes, everything it's in, we just leave it in, and we just ask you to cut it at a certain point and tape it down so that it stays in the skin. Because we're afraid if you pull it out, blood will come out and we'll lose that blood. In the mortuary, they have a way that they pull it out as they keep the blood in, and then they bury whatever they need to bury with the body. So we leave IV lines in. We leave almost all lines, as I'll explain in a second, all lines in the body. We just cut them, leave them in. Catheters, urinary catheters can be removed because that's not blood. However, if you think that it's going to cause bleeding when it's taken out, we then say leave it in. If there's any concern that it will bleed when it's removed, leave it. But technically it can be removed. Bandages, wound dressings, none of that is removed. Any blood that's found on clothing, linen, all of that should be taken and put in a bag and left there for the mortuary to pick up. Anything that spills after the person dies or contributed to their dying, as we mentioned, should be buried as well. We want the mortuary to bury everything. A patient who's intubated with an endotracheal tube. Technically, an endotracheal tube can be removed and sometimes some say it should be removed because, like we said, it's an indignity for a body, especially after rigor mortis sets in and the person, the tube's been left in. It would be very hard to close the mouth and the face becomes disfigured. So we actually say to remove the ET tube. But if there's a concern about it bleeding when it's taken out, then again, we say just leave it in. And I see a lot, especially like in the emergency room, I see a lot they leave it in. And I think that's fine. But oftentimes we take it out.
On the floor,
Yeah.
I have the experience, we do remove the ET tube during post-mortem care. And then my question is, let's say there is some blood in the saliva or in the secretions on the ET tube. Do we leave the tube, like wipe it with gauze and leave the gauze? Like, what is that?
I would say leave the tube. What would you say?
Whole tube in a plastic bag.
Yeah. Yeah, just leave it.
Leave the tube in a bag.
Yeah.
Or if you want to wipe with gauze, leave the bloody gauze in a bag.
Right. We usually err on the side of leaving as much for the mortuary to do. Just let it be, and they'll handle it. But it's a good question. So that's the one thing that's kind of confusing because we usually say leave everything there, but the endotracheal tube could sometimes be removed. Also, things like dentures, and actually I just had a case last week in the emergency room. Fake hair or prostheses, things like that, we leave them in and bury them. Right? You guys bury them, right?
They're glued to the scalp for sure.
Right.
For sure, not coming off. Except if they attach them, generally they'll still leave it on there.
Yeah. Yeah. So usually we leave that to be buried. But things that are like just there to enhance the body, like a hearing aid, things like that, obviously we'll remove. And even amputated limbs, as we said before, oftentimes are buried with the person.
Would that also include, like, for a transplant of organ that was implanted?
Yeah. So for the organ, it does not technically require burial because there's no bones. Oftentimes people want it to be buried. We get this request a lot, and usually we do try to, but it's not required. Do you guys get a lot of organs?
So sometimes. Okay.
Yeah.
If it's the next one, you always find that more always come and pick it up, sure. But it's not required.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So bones are required to be buried, but not organs.
If it's
Because if it's like an amputated toe,
yeah,
or
exactly.
that's a
If
bone.
the halacha is that it has bone and muscle.
Okay.
But usually bone, people feel like it's more significant and requires burial. I think maybe because in the resurrection it's going to be needed more.
How big?
What?
How big?
Kazai, I think they say, right? Kazai, I think.
So how did you not have a tumor problem with having this toe around for an entire week in your office?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably did. I was waiting. I was trying to get it buried.
Is it much
I mean, I'm not a Kohen. I don't
No,
think
it's
many
not
Kohen.
everyone comes in if they.
Maybe. Good point.
So why can't we do organ donation?
Oh, okay, so this question came up. So I'm sorry that I keep disagreeing with everything that you say, but we can do organ donation. Jewish law allows organ donation, yes. In fact, it encourages it. Yeah.
That's the first time I've ever.
Am I shocking you?
Yeah.
So let me be more clear. There's 3 types. I'm just going to be very quick. I'll give you a 3-minute summary. There's 3 types of organ donation, right? There's living donors, right? Like a kidney, bone marrow, things like that you donate and you go on with your life. I'll get back to it. Then there's a cadaveric organ donation, post-mortem from a dead body, let's say skin grafting, cornea, and then there's the gray area. So the first one, living donor, is 100% allowed. The only question is how risky it is. There were rabbis at a time when it was more risky than it is today who discouraged organ donation because they felt it was too much of a risk to put yourself into, and it wasn't right to put yourself into such a risk because you're not obligated to risk your life to save someone else's life if you're going to likely die. But today it's become so safe, even though it's not without risks. It's a good thing, and in some cases it's actually required, like bone marrow. If someone is a match for someone who needs a bone marrow transplant to save their life, it's required to give them that bone marrow because that's really almost no risk at all. So a living donor, like a kidney, is a huge mitzvah. Huge mitzvah. It's a beautiful thing. A cadaveric donor, if the person's already declared dead, that part of their body is now going to save life. It's also a mitzvah. There's a concern you have to bury right away, I said, but that part of the body is no longer dead once it's part of another person's body, so it doesn't require immediate burial. So it's actually not, a lot of people don't like doing it, but it's actually a beautiful thing as well if someone wants to do it. You know, Israel a few years ago was kicked out of the European Union organ sharing network because they weren't doing enough organ donation, but they started a lot of, they did a big campaign of education, and now actually even the ultra-Orthodox community has been leading in Israel with kidney donations. So, and they've gotten themselves back in. Last year, Israel had the most organ donations in the history of the state. So living donors and cadaveric donors, totally allowed. The gray area, there's a lot of gray area that's sometimes not allowed. If you don't accept brain death, for example, then you can't take an organ from someone who's considered to be alive if it will kill them. Or, you know, DCD, donation after cardiac death, is very controversial in Jewish law. So there's a middle area that is controversial. But there's a lot of organs that can be donated, and in my opinion, because Jews oftentimes are accused of not donating their fair share, of taking more than they give. I can tell you a story about it if you want, but it's a sad story, but funny, but mostly sad. I believe that we should be giving of those things that we're allowed to give, like blood, bone marrow, other things. I think we should be the leaders in giving those because we should be doing our fair share to give if we want to be able to receive. Any other questions? What?
You can say the story.
Fine. One time I got a call from a nurse in Saperstein. She needed the rabbi to come. She didn't tell me why. So I came up there, and she was like, Rabbi, I need your help with this patient. It's very confusing. This lady is driving us crazy. So I went in, I saw there's this lady sitting outside the patient's room, like guarding the room. And I tried to visit the patient, and she was like very much like, who are you? What are you doing here? I was like, I'm the rabbi. She said, oh, Rabbi? Okay, you can come in. So I visited with them a little bit. I didn't get the whole story. I couldn't figure out what was going on, so I went back out to the nurse. She says to me, okay, can I talk to you now? I was like, yeah, what's going on? She wasn't Jewish, this nurse, but very kind. I mean, I don't think she has anything against, I don't think she was doing this because she had any kind of dislike for Jews. She was totally sincere and asked a legitimate question. She says to me, you want to know who she is? She's his next door neighbor. And she saw the ambulance come to his house. So she followed the ambulance to the hospital. And she's been following him through the emergency room, up to the ICU, nonstop. Everyone who comes into the room, she interrogates them. She says, you're not here to take his organs, are you? We're Jewish and we don't give organs. And she's there protecting his body. That's why she was there. So the nurse then said to me, this is the sad part. The nurse says, Rabbi, I have a question. This was like 10 years ago. I hope it's changed by now. She just goes, how come, I've noticed since I've been working at this hospital, that whenever Jews are asked to give organs, they always say it's against their religion. But then we have Jews who need organs. They're always like doing whatever they can to get on the top of the list to receive an organ. I don't understand. You can't give organs, but you can receive them? That was her question. I was very embarrassed by it. I thought it was horrible. I was so sad. And the problem is, it's just an education matter. The fact is, we are allowed to give donor, and we should not be taking if we're not going to give our fair share also. Yes, there's some kinds that we can't give, but there's some kinds that we can give.
The myth, as far as the organ donation, people believe that just the organs can be harvested, left and right, and scattered all around.
Right.
Just giving the science of people just study the body, study anatomy, and just to be scattered. If it's specifically for a target or organ recipient who really need that particular
Right.
organ to survive, to live, then that.
Exactly. They call it halacha chola lefanenu. If there's a person who needs this, who's sick, that's a mitzvah. You know, it's a big issue, and we'll wrap up in a minute. But I see we're not even out of time yet. But still, I don't want to keep your time too much. But it's a big issue that we have with end-of-life care in this hospital. I hear it all the time because we're an academic medical center. People think when someone dies, the researchers are going to come and attack. Uh-oh, the person's dead. Researchers are going to start autopsies and researching, and it's not true. Autopsies don't happen without consent. Obviously, you know, this is a misconception. People sometimes get a little bit overboard with their concern, and sometimes we can help them to be calm about the fact that the body will be treated with dignity. Yes?
All right, a little bit back to the toe.
Sure.
Just because I'm so sorry, because I actually had a situation like this. Again, not in this hospital, but
Okay.
I had a patient who was literally getting discharged, he was an inpatient, and he had a toe amputated, and like, they were very traditional even, but the son came and asked for the toe to put in his freezer, so that when the father dies, they could bury the toe with the father. And
Wow.
this guy was like completely healthy, walking, like independent. Is that in a way, not anticipating death, but like I understand when you're in the process of death, you're an inpatient and you're preserving
Okay, so I have to correct what I said then a little bit. We don't plan for death when someone's dying because it's scary, but we are supposed to like purchase our burial plot even when we're young. They say that if you purchase your burial plot when you're young, it's what they call segula farichas yamim. You'll live longer. It's like, I don't know if it really means you'll live longer. We're gonna maybe do a study, but we couldn't get IRB approval. I'm joking, but I don't think people will actually live longer if they have purchased their burial plot. But I do think people will appreciate the fragility of life and recognize, that we have to make the most of our time. But there is this custom to, plan your funeral basically. So I don't think just the fact that they have their bone prepared, like ready, I don't think that's like any kind of. But interesting, yeah.
What if like somebody wants to be buried in another country? How do they transfer?
Yeah, we do this all the time. In fact, sometimes it's like the majority of people who die here, at least Orthodox patients, go to Israel. And it's a pretty simple process. I mean, they have certain amount of days of the week that there's flights to Israel, and the mortuary arranges the whole process. We try to get them out of here as quickly as possible and get the death certificate signed as quickly as possible and get everything. So they get to the mortuary, and the mortuary arrange which flights. They know they're experts on which flights are going which days, and get everyone on the flight. And really, but we leave it up to the mortuary basically to help us because they're experts in that. Right? Is there anything else you would say about that?
So it depends. If Israel specifically, there are some countries, for example, I'm not going to mention about Russia or Mexico or whatever, but let's say even Italy or Hungary or there are some countries that is definitely much more proof than jump. It does take a couple days, but we're able to do that as well.
Yeah.
You said that we do everything to prolong life, so I know a lot of some people are hesitant to do hospice.
Right.
And I actually had a coworker ask me can Orthodox Jews be DNR? So
Yeah. So we believe there are times when DNR is an appropriate thing because we don't want to cause people to suffer unnecessarily at the end of life. Hospice also, as long as it's not hastening death, if a person's in the dying process, we should help them die the most peaceful, dignified way possible. Not that we're hastening death or making it happen faster. The truth is, there's even been studies, that people on hospice live 25% longer than people, especially if they're going through chemo, and not to mention things like that. But hospice actually is more comfortable. It enables a person to live in a comfortable manner without being. A lot of times, the medical interventions are really bad for a person when they're dying. So the point is, if someone's dying, everyone dies. So there are times when we say allow natural death. So that's why DNR is sometimes allowed. Obviously, observant Jews sometimes utilize DNR less frequently or less aggressively, but it's still sometimes allowed. And sometimes a mitzvah. It's not a good thing to pound on someone's chest if it's not going to help them. And that's not a very dignified death. Hospice helps with that. Yeah.
What about people that aren't in the go-safe stage, but you talk about putting in a trach and then putting in a G-tube, and it's, I don't know, in my perspective, it looks like they're suffering bodies. They
Yeah.
might be living for months and months, but
Yeah.
there's no communication. They're just basically a body that you
Right.
are I don't know. It seems like you're dragging on their life.
Right. Okay, so what I started tonight with was Goses. Goses is the last stage, but there's actually a whole bunch of stages. So for example, we refer to someone, hopefully all of us, as what's called Chaye Olam. We have, a regular lifespan. Then there's something called Chaye Shah. That means someone who is terminal and likely to die within 6 months to a year or less, but there's an etiology that's currently the cause of their death, and you see that it's happening. Once someone is in the dying process, you can hear me if I just talk over it, right? Once someone is terminal, even though they're not in the dying process, there's much less of a requirement to prolong their life. We still can never hasten death, but we're not required necessarily, unless we can get them out of that and save their life such that they're Chaye Olam again. But if someone's in the Chaye Shah category, that they are now a terminal patient who we cannot cure, the requirement to prolong that life is much less strict. And there are often times when we just want to provide basic necessities, nutrition, hydration, some type of oxygenation usually, but we don't necessarily have to engage in aggressive surgeries or other interventions that are, what's considered heroic. Tipul shigrati is the term that we use in Hebrew. Does that answer your question? I mean, this is a big issue we deal with every single day here about how to treat patients who are dying and suffering, but they're not in the dying process, and the family or their rabbi wants to prolong their life, and the doctor thinks that that's actually just prolonging their suffering, and we have to navigate exactly how to treat them appropriately. That's why we encourage advanced directives.
This
are times, but not if they will die right away as a result. It's really case by case. It's hard to, but there is room in the halacha. Any other questions before we do the last little point? So just one last point, and I'll just say now, in case anyone has to get going, just if you don't mind, there's in this box over here, there's evaluations. So if everyone could just, the evaluations somewhere. If you could, everyone could just, the evaluations are here. Everyone just has to write excellent, excellent. I mean, everyone just about the evaluation. I was just told that it's required, like I have to submit these. And also, there's these books. If anyone wants these red books, we have dozens of them in the chapel. We also have a new one that's like an ethics book. We don't have enough of those to give out, but they're available on Amazon. But the red ones we give out for free. And that has all this information in it. So the last thing, just to mention briefly, is, yes?
I have a question. Do we have a Jewish pulse? People were asking me for Jewish pulse.
We don't have a Jewish pulse. We have a Jewish advanced directive.
A Jewish advanced directive.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's available in the chapel or in our office.
Okay.
Next door to the chapel. Yeah. Sorry? Why is it called Jewish? Because it eats food with lots of cholesterol. No, I'm joking. It's Jewish because we made a new advanced directive, which I think is a very good advanced directive this hospital has, but there are some things on it that, we want to reduce any barriers. If someone looks at an advanced directive, we want them to fill it out. Sometimes people look at an advanced directive and they say, you know what, this doesn't feel right to me, so they don't do it. So for example, the Cedars-Sinai advanced directives gives an option when it says, like, what are your choices for funerals or cremation? So we took that word out of ours because we didn't want to give people the option. Now, if a Jew wants to be cremated, they can write it in there. There's no prohibition against them writing it in there. But we didn't want to put words like that are in your face that go against Jewish tradition. So we changed the wording to make it feel, like in accordance with Jewish values. We also added in there that in addition to appointing a surrogate, they can appoint their rabbi or institution to also be involved in the decision making. And we used a few other spiritual questions in there about funeral arrangements and things like that are relevant for in the Jewish context. So it's just meant to be, it's the same as the Cedars-Sinai Advanced Directive, but just a little bit tweaked to feel Jewish. Yeah.
I have another question. As nurses and staff that work with the dying, if a Jew has selected cremation, can we make that call to the mortuary that's going to be providing that cremation service?
So if you don't make the call in your role in the hospice, what will happen?
Somebody else will have to make it.
Yeah.
But can I ask a nurse to do that, or halachically am I?
So I'll tell you my approach. If I haven't shocked you all already enough tonight, I don't know if you're just going to kick me out for this one. Okay, in Judaism, we do not encourage cremation. And if people ask me, I tell them right away, we don't like cremation. Actually, okay, I'll just tell you one more story. I promise we'll be out by 9, even though we said 9:15. Really, we're early now. So I remember I got called to a room once. It was the pre-op upstairs, and they're like those, they're not really rooms, but, and that's all I knew was rabbi requested in pre-op. So I went up there, and there was a woman there, their daughter, just hanging out, and I walked in, I was like, hi, I'm the rabbi, and the daughter was like, we didn't ask for a rabbi, we don't want a rabbi, we don't need a rabbi, who sent the rabbi? So I was like, no, it's fine, it must be a mistake, don't worry, just make it around, just wanted to say hi, have a good day. She's like, okay, good, bye. I was like, okay, lovely, nice to meet you too. So then as I'm turning around to leave, all of a sudden, the son comes in, the big beard and the yarmulke, and sits aside. He's like, oh, Baruch Hashem, the rabbi that I called is here. Thank you, Rabbi. Come on, meet my mother, my sister. And she goes, oh, he called you, figures, and rolls her eyes. I'm like, oh, man, family dynamics. I'm being triangulated already. And he's like, yeah, come on in, Rabbi. So she was like, the rabbi was just leaving. So I'm like, yes, I was just leaving. See ya. So he was like, oh, we're going to say a prayer? She was like, no, it's a routine surgery. It's fine. Go, Rabbi. I was like, okay, bye. Then all of a sudden the daughter goes, wait, actually, Rabbi, you know what? Maybe you could settle a little family dispute we're having. I was like, no, maybe I can't. I'm going to have, no. But I was like, okay, what can I do? So she was like, with the patients right there, alert, pre-op, ready to go into surgery. The daughter goes, Rabbi, could you please tell my brother that when my mother dies and her body is cremated, as is her wish, that she won't go to hell like my brother says she will. So I was like, you know what? I don't know if now is the time for this conversation. I understand it's a very routine procedure. We could talk later. Don't worry. I don't think you're going to hell. And let's talk about this later. So I start to leave. And then the son goes, oh, look what the rabbi didn't say. He didn't say no. Notice how the rabbi didn't say no? He agrees with me. You're going to hell if you burn your. I'm like, oh my God, you idiot. So so I was like, okay, you know what? I don't think you're going to hell. It's true that cremation is against Jewish tradition, but if that's your wish, that's your wish. We're not going to fight you on it. The son was really mad at me for saying that. And afterwards, I pulled him aside and I said, what are you doing? She's an adult. You tell your opinion and then you stop. If your sister asks you to be involved in cremation, you say, I can't do this. You already know I'm not in favor of this. I'm not making the call. I'm not making the arrangements. I can't be involved with this. But once you've told them your opinion, you don't need to fight it because it's just going to cause them to hate you even more and cause them to be further and further away. Now, in the hospital, our role is to show compassion for people. There was a study in Oregon. We have this here at Cedars-Sinai. We just had this recently. You know that in Oregon they have physician-assisted suicide, physician aid in dying. We have it here too, but they've had it for much longer there. They've had it the longest. And they did a really interesting study there. The study was as follows. They asked everyone a questionnaire when they engage in assisted suicide in Oregon because they really study it carefully. And one of the questions they ask is, are you a member of a religious community? Then if they say yes, has your clergy been involved with this process? If they say yes, does your clergy support or oppose what you're doing? Now, they also look at who gets the medication but then doesn't do it. 50% of the people get the medication but then don't end their lives. So they want to see, is there any correlation between the people that don't do it? Like, why are people not doing it? And they found something very interesting. Those who describe themselves as religious, if their clergy opposed their decision and told them their opposition, they were more likely to do it. And if their clergy showed them compassion, they were less likely to do it. And it says a lot to me. So I believe that it's important to find a way to not condone something that we're against, if you're against it, to not say, I think what you're doing is great, I'm in support of you, to be clear, especially if someone asks, what does Judaism say? We have to tell the truth. We can't make up lies about the Torah. So we would say, you know what, the Torah does not support this. And a lot of times in the hospital, I've had success a number of times where people have said to me, we're cremating, is that against Judaism? And I'll say things like, well, tell me why. Because as chaplains, we don't usually say yes or no. So I'd be like, well, tell me more about why you've chosen cremation. And they'll say, well, it's cheaper. I'll say, what if we could get you burial for cheaper than cremation? Would that matter? And oftentimes they say, well, yeah, if it was cheaper then. I say, okay, so let's do that. I guarantee you we can get you cheaper. What were you going to pay? Let's get it cheaper. And oftentimes we can arrange and we make sure it's cheaper. And people have changed their minds many times, and I think that's a good thing. We're not trying to change them, but I'm saying if they change their minds. And we've had times where someone asked for cremation in their advance directive but didn't tell anyone. Then we found it after they died, and then their whole family was distraught and upset and horrified to find out, and so we did not follow their wishes. Because we said, if they would have known their whole family would be so upset, maybe they wouldn't have asked for this. And if everyone's in agreement and it's unanimous, sometimes we don't follow their wishes. But when an adult of sound mind has made a decision and they've decided this is what I want, even though we can't tell them we're in favor of it, I think it's important to show them compassion, especially if we represent a Jewish community or Orthodox Judaism or whatever it is, that we want to show them that we are people that they can relate to and talk to. And if someone's going to call anyways, yes, probably it's better not to make the call. But if you're the one supporting them and they need your help, and to protest it and say, I'm not making this call, and it would make things more difficult, would cause them, to be more upset and to break the relationship, then I think since someone's going to call anyways, I think you could make the call. But it just make you all think that I'm some kind of heretic.
What is the opinion on physician aid in dying? Because we've had that a few times on our floor.
I know.
And I've asked Rabbi
On what?
Physician aid in dying. Well, there's not much to say about it. It's not allowed.
Not allowed to finish, right? Okay.
But then we have all this nuance that I just said, meaning we can show people compassion, even if it's not allowed. We're allowed to be nice to people, even if we don't agree with what they're doing. In fact, not only are we allowed to, we should be. If they ask our opinion, it's one thing, but people do things that we don't agree with, but we should still be nice to them, show them compassion, and maybe they won't even do it if we show them compassion, because that is studies show.
Quick question.
Yeah.
In the event of a medical emergency, what might be done that, according to Jewish law, you cannot undo that prolongs a person's life?
Yeah, so this is why a lot of times, in an emergency room especially, it's a very careful decision, intubation, because if something is supporting someone's life, such that if it was removed, it would cause death immediately or within hours, then we can't remove it. So we want to be careful to start something if we know that if we start it, we might not be able to stop it. So it's one of the reasons why sometimes we don't start things. When you talked about prolong it. Sometimes we say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't start this because it's going to get us stuck in a situation that's much more sad.
Are you called in often, like at that moment?
Yeah.
You don't know what to do.
One time we had, I can't stop with the stories. And this will be the last thing, and I'll tell you the last point, and we'll just finish. I'll stay all night. I'll keep staying, but I don't want to keep you too late. One time we had a family who was like adamant, DNR is against Jewish law, and they would not accept the DNR. And the staff was trying to convince them, like, your loved one is suffering, we're prolonging suffering, and there's no hope for recovery. And they were like, nope, our rabbi said, no DNR, we're against DNR, we won't accept it. So then one day he calls me, he says, the son of the patient, could you come to our room? They were in Saperstein. I got up there and he goes, Rabbi, we want to make sure that my father's no code. I said, no code. Okay, you guys said no DNR, right? I said, yeah, no DNR. I said, you still don't want a DNR? I said, yes, we are against DNR. But you want no code? I said, yes. I said, okay, I think I need to understand what you're saying because there's a contradiction. Let's talk about what code means and what DNR means. I said, why don't you tell me about what happened? What changed? So he said, oh, I'll tell you. We're here in the ice in Saperstein, and in the room next to us, all of a sudden we heard the bells ringing, and we heard code blue, code blue. So I was like, what's code blue? So I went out and I looked, and I saw dozens of people running into this room, nurses and residents and pharmacists, and they're banging on his chest and putting in lines, and there was like papers flying and blood, and it was like crazy, and the next thing I know, the patient's declared dead, and there's blood everywhere. And I said, whatever just happened in there, we don't want to happen to our father because he's very frail and weak and dying. So I said, okay, that was the R in DNR? That was the R, resuscitation, right? And that's what they've been trying to tell you is not going to be in his best interest. So now you saw what it is. So if you want no code, that means you're asking for DNR. So he goes, let me call my rabbi back. So he called the rabbi, and he was like, oh, yeah, now that you explain it that way, yes, DNR is totally allowed, but you should be. And so we changed to DNR. But sometimes it's like a matter of knowing what you're getting yourself into when you ask for everything. What does everything mean? I could tell you so many more stories. So many stories are popping in my head right now, but I'm going to hold myself back. Chaplains, we love telling stories because, especially in this kind of group like this with like colleagues, because you know there's so much confidentiality. I'm still keeping confidential. I'm not giving you details, but it's like fun to be able to.
Do you often see cases where people are told to keep the patient DNR and the rub doesn't have like a medical knowledge or medical background?
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes it's hard. Yeah. Sometimes it's a challenge. Yeah.
How do you approach saying Vidui confession?
Very good.
How do you ask the question to them? When do you do it? Are you doing it when they're in a scosis?
Yeah.
Are you doing it in the shop?
Okay, so an important point to mention is that people often think that, like in Catholicism, it's very important, last rites. We don't call it last rites anymore. They call it the anointing of the sick. But there's rites. There's rituals that need to be done before a person dies. So people think that Judaism doesn't have that, but it's a mistake. We have last rites also. In particular, vidui. There's a very important special prayer that we believe is a big merit for a person to say. And the idea of vidui is it's like a confession and ask for, apology to family, to loved ones, to God, and ask for forgiveness. And it's a really beautiful tradition, asking for forgiveness from God, closeness with God. And the real idea of vidui is to say it when a person is clear enough that they can actually engage in repentance. And that's why, I know of people who have said vidui dozens of times. Every time they go into major surgery, they'll say vidui prior. But we also believe that a person can still hear things even after they can't interact. So sometimes, if a person didn't have a chance to say vidui, and it's a touchy subject because it's scary to bring up the topic, we bring it up in a way that's hopeful. Like, not everyone who says vidui dies. It's a merit to say it. It's a special prayer, so we encourage you to say it. But sometimes people didn't have a chance to say it, so we say it for them. And we say the words as if we're them, because we want them to hear the words and say the words. So we often do it when someone is a goses, but it really should be said before they're a goses. And it's an important prayer that we like. But we don't push it on people, something that we encourage and we talk about when asked. That last thing that I was going to say, and then any questions you have, but I want to just have you feel free that you can leave if you need to, just because this comes up a lot. And the last page is just one interesting thing that people don't always know about, which is that, if it's Shabbat or a festival, it's different if it's a Sabbath. And the body is what's called muksa. We don't handle the body. So like closing the eyes, things like that, well, we don't do it if it's Shabbat. We don't tie knots. So if you were going to tie a knot, we can't tie a knot on Shabbat. So we find other ways of doing it oftentimes. Or if a nurse wants to do it and they're not Jewish, they don't have to keep Shabbat, so they can do it. But it just adds one layer of complication just to be aware of. Sometimes that's a little bit different on the Sabbath. Yeah.
For the confessional prayer, if it doesn't scare the patient, how early is too early to do that?
Well, there isn't really too early because we say vidui all the time. I mean, it's a good thing to do. It's just that the vidui is a little different. So anytime that there's any kind of concern in one's life, you know that they used to have a custom in Europe before the Holocaust. We lost this custom. Holocaust killed a lot of people, and it killed traditions. There was a custom in Europe that in the type of hospitals that they had then, that if a person was in the hospital for 3 days, on day 3, everyone says vidui. There's a representative of the Bikur Cholim Society that would go around and say to people, we do this for everyone. We don't want you to be afraid because this is what we do for everybody. We say this vidui prayer, so it doesn't mean you're dying. Don't worry, we don't know something about you that you don't know. It's just a prayer that we say on day 3 of being hospitalized. And they would do that in the hospitals as a way of not scaring people. And everyone would say vidui on day 3 of being in the hospital.
It's better when you're alert.
Totally better when you're alert. Then it makes more sense. But the idea is that you really engage in a process. I remember, I'll conclude with this, and then I'll stick around and ask you questions, but because this is a nice story. My first vidui here in the hospital, my first death, it was like one of my first days here. A woman was dying, and her husband asked her rabbi to come by, and it was the sweetest couple, very elderly, very kind. The woman was still a little bit alert, but she was dying. The man was totally alert and very frail, bent over her, and I came in, and they said to me, of course, it was like my first day, so I didn't know the answer, but they were like, Rabbi, my wife is leaving. We've been married for almost 70 years. What are we supposed to do? What are the Jewish customs? It's like all this stuff I just told you, I don't know if I knew all of it then. So whatever I remembered to say, and at one point I said, there's a prayer, a very beautiful prayer called the vidui. He said, what is vidui? I said, well, it's a chance to, apologize if you ever hurt someone, to forgive them if they ever hurt you, kind of come to peace with each other. So he was all bent over, but then he stood up, and he goes, Rabbi, we've been married for almost 70 years. I have nothing to apologize to her for, and she has nothing to apologize to me for, I guarantee you. And he started to cry, and she was crying. It was like the most beautiful. He was very sincere about that, very special. So anyways, we should know much happiness and good health, but we should be prepared when things happen. This is reality. And thank you all. This is really hard stuff. Especially, we really appreciate you. I want you to know this. What we said tonight is not being said in terms of like what we expect of you and demand. You better treat these patients this way. It's like a partnership. We really appreciate that people go out of their way to care for patients so compassionately and so carefully. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. And we also want to work with you to be good patients in a good community. And so, we're a team in this, and we just really thank you for taking the time to talk about this difficult subject. Have a good night. Thank you all. So if you could fill out, there's